Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to our event that has been put together in anticipation or in advance of Saudi Crown Prince's visit to Washington next week. I'd like to welcome you all for coming, welcome our distinguished guests, and welcome our very distinguished panelists who we're very grateful have agreed to join at this time. Elise Labott is going to be moderating it. Elise you have the resumes of everybody, so I will not go through in detail, but Elise is a well-known personality from CNN. Tom Friedman, obviously the well-known columnist. Bernard Haeckel, the chairman of our advisory board of Princeton University. Norm Roulet. Norm, am I allowed to say you were station chief, CIA station chief in Riyadh? But Norm knows a lot about Saudi Arabia.
Do you prefer Bernie or Bernie?
And Stephen Cook very kindly agreed to replace Robert Maley. Robert was scheduled to come and was in Riyadh and had a meeting with the Crown Prince yesterday. The meeting got delayed to yesterday night and he was unable to make the plane. And we thank Stephen very much for coming in to, what's the term, save our bacon at the last minute?
I guess in the new Saudi Arabia, you can save one's bacon.
That's right.
So we thank you all. I think it's going to be a very interesting panel. There's a lot going on in this space today. As you know, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is coming next week. Saudi Arabia is going through a historical transformation. He is going to be going to a number of cities across America. This will be a little bit of politics and policy, but a lot of business and reaching out to the financial services community, to the technology community, to the entertainment community, to the oil services community, etc. So it's going to be quite the tour of America. American support and cooperation with Saudi Arabia has been an anchor of Middle East stability, or whatever remains of Middle East stability, for the last 50 years. So the continuation of that and the issues that affect the Saudi-American relationship are going to be discussed and debated in this panel. We will have about an hour, 15 minutes or an hour of discussion, and then half an hour of question and answer. Elise, please.
Thank you, Ali. And thank you so much for coming today. I'm usually not so blown away by the crowd, to be honest, but I mean, the caliber of people that are here in this room, any one of you could be doing this panel or moderating this discussion, and we all see a lot of old friends and distinguished guests here today. So looking forward to this discussion and this stellar panel. I think what we're going to do here today is really kind of challenge a lot of the narratives that we always have traditionally thought of when it comes to Saudi Arabia, and some of the new narratives on both the positive and the negative about the new Crown Prince and his bold reforms and his style. I think these narratives are wildly disparate, but also probably neither one of them is fully correct. And so I think this panel will be uniquely poised to challenge some of what we're all thinking about, not only the Crown Prince, but Saudi Arabia today and the upcoming visit. So let's start, Tom, with you. I feel like this is, Mohammed bin Salman is effectively, the new ruler of Saudi Arabia. We expect the king to hand over power to him in the not too distant future. And a lot of hopes have been placed on this young leader. He's going to be a moderate. He's going to transform the economy. Are we expecting a little too much from him on what he's going to be able to do in the near future?
Well, Elise, thanks so much for being here. And maybe the best way I can answer your question is just give you how I've approached the whole subject. I've actually had a chance to interview MBS now 3 times over the last 4 years, and to be in Saudi Arabia and get a sense of what's going on there. And you won't understand where I'm coming from if you don't understand that I showed up in the Middle East for the first time as a cub reporter in Beirut in 1979. Got off the plane for UPI, and the first 2 stories I covered was this revolution in Iran and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Those were the first two stories I covered on a typewriter. A typewriter was a device where you pressed a key, it created pressure on a roller. And of course, we couldn't cover the takeover of the Grand Mosque from Saudi Arabia because no one could get in then. But we all understood these were two seismic events. And I believe they framed certainly my career in the Middle East and framed the Middle East up until recent years. This is Islamic revolution in Iran and the Saudi then reaction to the takeover of the Grand Mosque of Mecca was to take Saudi Arabia on a real right turn. Right turn in terms of a much more puritanical, Salafist interpretation of the faith, which was exported around the world. The Iranians did the same, and they're both fueled by oil money, and it changed the face and character of modern Islam. Look at a graduating picture of Cairo University, 1960. You'll see men and women, and basically nobody's covered. And look at the graduating class last year, and you'll understand how the face of Islam, not to mention its character and tenor, was changed by this. I believe that change is one of the things that led to Al-Qaeda, 9/11, all these things that happened, and ultimately us spending $3 or $4 trillion now countering, radical extremism. That's the context with which that's my baggage. You can like it or not like it, but that's my baggage. So I see the Crown Prince and what he has been doing around, not, as he said to me, don't ever say I'm reforming Islam. I am restoring Islam to its true pluralistic nature, a religion that actually respected others and respected women. And for a lot of years, I was very critical of Saudi Arabia because you'd come to Saudi leaders and they say, arrest that guy. We would, America, and they'd arrest him. And you'd come to them and say, stop that guy from sending money, and they'd stop that guy from sending money. But there's one thing they never did. They never fought the war of ideas against the Al-Qaedas. They never took them on ideologically. And what has interested me is the willingness of Mohammed bin Salman to do that in his own voice, and then to empower others to do it. So I think in strategic terms, the idea that this giant right turn that I think took Sunni Islam down a really bad path for women and for that community, the idea that we might be coming back through this young man, through the only way it can come back, which is through a Saudi leader, keeper of the two holy mosques, I mean now his father, but probably soon one day him, that is a strategic shift that I cannot think of anything more important. Let me just finish this point. That to me is a huge upside. And at the same time, I think he has a huge downside. The same boldness that makes him willing to take on that challenge can come out in bullying, bullying foreign policy. It can come out in a power and money grab at the Ritz-Carlton. And it can come out in, I think, intimidating his ministers. So a lot of them are afraid to speak up. And my philosophy is very simple. Where I see good things, I want to encourage them, call them out, and try to enhance them. And where I see bad things, want to call them out, and because perfect's not on the menu, friends. Madison nor Jefferson are in line to succeed King Salman.
Well,
so
yeah,
that's where I come from.
We're going to get to that Jeffersonian Democrat in a dish dasha. Tom, you write, if Saudi women are this is if you haven't read it, last week Tom wrote a memo to the president on Saudi Arabia from the would-be ambassador, if there was one, which there's not, which is another panel. You write, if Saudi women are empowered, which will be fully true only when the rules of, quote, male guardianship over them are lifted and the kingdom becomes a more normal, connected, and productive society, Saudi Islam will naturally become more moderate and inclusive. Given how Saudi Arabia sets the tone for Islam globally, this will isolate extremists and empower moderates everywhere. It's huge. You are usually more cynical about the power of one man to transform a country, let alone a region. And so I have to ask again, the bold moves notwithstanding, and we agree that they are bold, are we placing too much pressure on one man to be able to not only transform his country, transform a region, and Islam at large?
It's a very good question, at least. And yes, we are, in part because he is himself, and if you read on in that article, I know you did, it's one of the points I made. His team is way too small. He needs to institutionalize this. He needs to broaden it, and part of broadening it means also allowing critical voices in, not arresting intellectuals. It's allowing, I don't expect a democracy to break out there tomorrow, but unless these reforms are rooted in some kind of more open political context, if it's just reform from the top down as opposed to authoritarianism from the top down that he's replacing, if it's just top down, if it is not anchored, I think in a more empowered and open society and a broader team with institutions, it will fail.
Bernie, well, let's get to the foreign policy part of this in a minute. Steve, obviously the Crown Prince has a lot of power. And if you talk, if you're reading a lot of what's coming out of Saudi Arabia, and you were there and you talked to Saudis, it seems as if there's a real appetite for this kind of transformation. But can there be a backlash against this? I mean, can he handle all of this? Can one man do it? Does he have the infrastructure to make it happen? And is there going to be a fight between the young, socially progressive, economically, globally minded people with the traditional society, the religious, the people who are resistant to change?
Well, thanks for the question, Liz. One of the things that struck me about my time in Saudi Arabia in November, and I was there during the whole Ritz-Carlton thing. Actually, I was worried he'd arrest more people and I'd get bumped from my hotel. But what struck me, and I tried very hard to speak almost exclusively to average Saudis. I didn't have a single elite on my agenda. What struck me was how shrewd, how calculating Mohammed bin Salman has been in anticipation of that backlash. So what are the first things that he did? He has put the religious police in their place. They're now in the Ministry of Interior where they have to fight for resources. They can't arrest people. He then said women can drive. He started, you can go to a concert now and move it. If you think about Saudi Arabia's demographics, he is part of that 18 to 35-year-old demographic. He has very shrewdly gone about building enormous public support for him. I had a woman tell me that he is the best thing that has ever happened to her, because not only are the religious police now put in their place, the fact that she will be able to drive, and I don't want to give the Saudis credit for being the last country on the face of the earth to drive, but the enormous burden that this relieves on average families, women to drive, and the way in which she and her daughters can now manage their families is extraordinarily important. And this is building tremendous public support for him. So when that backlash does come, if it does come, he has a wellspring of support within Saudi society for what he has done. Now, among the young people that I met, they said, look, if he doesn't do the things he's doing, there's going to be more problems.
Right?
There's going to be more problems if he doesn't do the things that he's doing, because there's pent-up demand for it. This isn't a closed society. Saudis know what's going on around them, and they want a different lifestyle. And he's clearly, I don't think that Mohammed bin Salman is a liberal. I think he's been extraordinarily politically shrewd about what he's done. Now, you talk about backlash within the family. I think in Washington sometimes we run around with our hair on fire. If a Saudi ruler ends up, at the Mayo Clinic for a checkup or something, we pick up something that's going on within the family. My sense is by the time the moment comes that King Salman abdicates, if he in fact he does, I know that's everybody's betting that'll happen relatively soon. Most of, if not all of those problems with him will have been resolved behind closed doors, and we'll see something relatively smoother than we are expecting.
So essentially, the Saudis are just going to fall into line.
I think that's in part what was happening with the Ritz-Carlton thing. If you think kind of broadly about Saudi history, and I don't want to step on Bernie here at all, but it was kind of reminiscent of the way in which his grandfather consolidated power and the Arabian Peninsula. It was kind of basically sticking it to all of his rivals. He had the ability, telling everybody, here's the new Sharif in town. That's a joke. And everybody better fall into line.
Well, the new Sharif is also the old Sharif often. So.
Anyways.
Bernie, talk about that history and how the Crown Prince is different in terms of whether it's, as Steve said, it's just kind of history repeating itself and the way that the Saudis resolve their political differences, or does this guy have some political shrewdness that's new and different, and you see him being able to do something that nobody can?
First, thank you, Elise, and I would like to thank Ali and his staff at the Arabia Foundation. So I think a couple of points. First, nothing that MBS is doing is for pleasing the West. He's doing it because he has to do it for himself. All right, and I think that's we should underscore that.
I think we should all remember that. It's not about us.
Yeah,
Usually
it's not really
is,
about
but
us.
It's not.
Now, it just so happens that what he's doing happens to correspond to our interests and our desire to remain powerful and important in that region of the world. So I'm a fan. Now, having said that, let me tell you a bit about Saudi history. You had, with the consolidation of the kingdom, a single ruler who had all power. Then he died, and his sons essentially, after 1953, shared power. That sharing expanded after 1964, and because they were the sons of the king were roughly of equal age. And what they did is they divvied up the country between themselves into fiefdoms, one ruling over a ministry, another over some other bit of the government. Over time, that led to complete stasis or inability of the country, of the system, to reform itself because everything had to be consensual. And by consensus, I mean unanimity. Like they all had to agree. And that meant that nothing happened. And so the hand that MBS has been given is a really poor hand, actually, because all the reforms that should have happened have not happened. And he's been in a Tesla, and he knows what's coming down the pike. And he knows that oil is going to lose its value over time. So he has a very short span of time in which to change and move this place, move the country, turn it around. And that's why he's in a hurry. It's not just his youth. He's in a terrible hurry because he knows that if he doesn't change, that country is headed, certainly without him, to disaster. It was going to hit a wall in a very bad way. And ladies and gentlemen, the alternative to the Al Saud are Daesh in Saudi Arabia. Okay, it's ISIS.
Is it really an either or?
I think so, because they are the most violent and most organized group in the Sunni world today. I mean, it's ISIS or Al Qaeda or some version of Islamism. Okay, and so one has to wish him well, one has to help him, and I agree with Tom. He has a very kind of shallow bench. And he's doing a lot of things all at once, and we need to make sure, especially given what's going on in the region, where you have several failed states, that this state, which is the most important state for Islam and for the global economy, remains stable. And I think that is the challenge that America faces in thinking about MBS.
Norm, we had a quick chat right before, and you said a few things that, kind of really made me perk up in terms of, I think that a lot of people ascribe their own, westernized views to what he's doing. For instance, we talk about what he's doing with corruption, but, that's not really a very democratic way of locking all the princes up and taking their money. If he wants to reform, are these true reforms, or is this just in a kind of autocratic way of getting his agenda through?
Well, there's certainly reforms. It's certainly autocratic. I think he has the title of king or crown prince in his name somewhere, or will be. And there aren't many democratic kings or potentates in the region who conduct affairs in a Jeffersonian, Madison-type style, but most of them have a lot less cash and a much smaller country and a much different set of problems. So it's not quite as loud when it occurs. I think you have to ask yourself, would he have been able to acquire $100 billion from the various princes had he said in a letter to each of them, please return the money? Now, if your answer is no to that, then go to Bernie's excellent points of the imperative that he's got to move very quickly on some severe problems. He needs money. He needs finances. So he's got a choice. How does he acquire the funding? How did they acquire the funding? And what does he do to get it back? I'm not condoning all of the activities. In fact, it's not our place in some ways to condone the activities. And if I can throw in one more comment, we often talk about MBS. So I have met him a number of times. I've been to the kingdom a number of times. His bench is small, but it is not non-existent. And in my old job, my job was to task people to write on things, to do things. And there's a whole lot of really smart think tankers in the room. So I'm asked to task you all to say, can you write a piece that doesn't have MBS in it? Can you talk about his economic advisors, his security advisors, his military advisors? Not every decision comes from this man in that polity, but we talk about it in our world as if he is the only juggler there. And if Saudi Arabia fails or succeeds, it's going to be on the skills of the jugglers on his left and right, not so much on him. He will not be able to run the whole country.
Do you think he's taken on a kind of mythic proportion in everyone's mind?
I think it's a great soundbite. Yeah, MBS is a great 3 letters to be able to say. It's and the issues are bold. The events are dramatic. It fits great into our news cycle. But that's not how countries work. When Crown Prince Mukran was removed, when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef was removed, what was the response in country? Now there was a step-by-step progression through this. And when we talk about the absence of consensus in Saudi Arabia, I would just ask this group, raise your hand if you've been in an inner circle meeting in Saudi Arabia. All right, so none of you actually know what consensus is in Saudi Arabia, other than people saying there isn't consensus anymore in Saudi Arabia. That doesn't sound like reliance on data and analytics in the most rigorous way. So I think he's building consensus, but it's very different with an entirely new group of people with whom we may be unfamiliar. And a final footnote, and I will.
Well, just back to the same question: is everyone putting too much pressure on the?
I think so, and I think we're also pushing for too much change too quickly. Were I the Saudis, the one thing I would ask from the West would be patience. Patience, and by the way, the recognition that some of this is going to fail. And when it does, their response to that failure will tell us how the process will succeed in the end or what other challenges they will face.
Tom had brought up, that he's chipping away at the Islamic extremism in Saudi. Does this mean the end of Islamic extremism in Saudi, given his social reforms? Do you see it playing out like that? And, what about the kind of Sunni extremism in Saudi Arabia? Does this mean it's going to, all dissipate? I would think you don't think that.
Is this to me? I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I think you have to look at events in Saudi Arabia in a broader regional context to understand the imperative. There are 3 or 4 things happening in front of us that need more attention. Terrific unemployment throughout the region, massification of education, and terrific unemployment. There's a war on political Islam. Can we have peace in a region with Izzuddin Qasim brigades, Hamas, and the Iranians? We have the war, the rollback of Iran. Is that possible, and how are they changing the region? We have an aging leadership in 10 or 11 different key places in the region. The Saudi solution to this, which will include how they handle the Medina and Mecca and their role in the region, in the world, will either raise the region or, candidly, if this doesn't succeed, and I believe it will present the region with its most terrific challenge.
Steve, let's get into these bold moves on the foreign policy front. Starting with the Lebanese prime minister. There's also obviously what some would call his adventures in Yemen. That there's been a lot done to end the conflict there. Is the Crown Prince and his military advisors, as Norm points out, are they spreading themselves too thin?
Well, one of the things that's striking to me about the decision-making in Saudi Arabia right now is how I think deft they've been domestically, but almost incompetent on the foreign policy front. Yemen is clearly a black stain on Mohammed bin Salman. It's a humanitarian disaster of extraordinary proportions. I think the impulse was a good one. There was a perception about Iranian influence in Yemen. But in fact, much of what the Saudis have done in Yemen have become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Allegedly, an intervention there to prevent the destabilization of the Arabian Peninsula, to contain Iranian influence, and in fact, that intervention has created the dynamics where you have a deepening of Iranian influence in Yemen. The situation with Qatar, how much benefit has that brought the Saudis at this point? The Qataris have not folded. They have found a way to manage going forward. That may not matter to the Saudis and their partners, the Emiratis, but it certainly has complicated things for the United States. And again, Mohammed bin Salman and his advisors don't have much to show for it. They have a stalemate in between them and one of their small but yet important neighbors. In Lebanon, I've heard Norm say before that there really wasn't much of a choice for Mohammed bin Salman to do what he did with regard to that was the hand that he had to play. But again, it doesn't seem to have brought tremendous dividends to the Saudis in Lebanon. So I think that these moves, I think there's the impulse may be right, but execution hasn't been very good. I think the adventure in Yemen is a function of the way in which the Saudis perceive the United States in the region and our retrenchment in the previous 8 years and so far the first year of the Trump administration. But again, it doesn't make for a successful effort in Yemen. Maybe they'll be successful going forward. But again, this is one of the wealthiest countries in the region pouncing on one of the poorest countries in the region and creating a humanitarian disaster that we would be focused on if not for Syria.
Let's, Tom, let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, in the region, what is, in your view, and then Bernie, I'd love you to jump in, what is your view behind these kind of adventures overseas? Is he spreading himself too thin? But more importantly, is it really about countering Iran? Everyone, again, I think we all kind of boil it down to they're countering Iran's influence in the region and this is the big threat. Qatar, is it about, they're with Iran, or is it about, Qatar trying to spread its wings on the international stage and them not liking that? What is behind this rationale?
Well, again, if I go to 30,000 feet, I would say the two biggest strategic events happening in the region is Saudi Arabia's and MBS's moves on Islam, which would reverberate throughout the region and throughout the world. And the other is that Iran today controls effectively, indirectly, 4 Arab capitals. That's a huge strategic change in the region. They effectively control Beirut, Sana'a, Baghdad, and Damascus. And so even paranoids have enemies. And by the way, I'm just struck at the imbalance in the press coverage. How many people do you think the Iran-Russia Bashar Assad axis killed outside of Damascus in the last 10 days? In East Ghouta. Yeah, I mean,
A few.
A few. The asymmetry in coverage, because we tend to cover what we can, so we can get into Saudi Arabia. So we'll write about all this stuff going on there. The fact that Iran has completely perverted the democracy in a country that I still hold near and dear, Lebanon, created a government inside the government. The fact that they've mobilized mercenaries from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia to fight alongside Assad's regime in Iraq. So they're getting away with murder, quite literally, it seems to me, in a way that surely isn't advancing the interests of the region. I'm no fan of Bibi Netanyahu, but what the hell is Iran doing on the Israel-Syria border? What is that about? So I'm troubled by that because I'm also not anti-Iranian, but what are you doing there? What have you done to advance the region? So you've got this terrible problem. The real truth is, and I've written this before, the peace process we need most in the Middle East is between Sunni and Shia, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And unless you go back, to me, the mother of all peace treaties, the Ta'if Agreement, no victor, no vanquished, and the minority gets overrepresented, you will never solve Lebanon, you will never solve Syria, you will never solve Iraq. And these two powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, will literally drain each other. They will literally drain each other by constantly chasing one another. And what I worry about for Saudi Arabia is Iran has 40 years of experience of fighting with proxies. They wrote the book. They literally wrote the book. And Saudi Arabia has no experience of that. And Qatar is 300,000 people with $300 billion trying to project power. It's boys with toys, and it's really not going to change this region. And so call me naive, but unless there is some way to find some modus vivendi between Tehran and Riyadh, so both these people can turn their energies inward, because two things are going to happen in the next decade. First of all, if you've been following my column, Mother Nature is going to kill them all long before they kill each other. I promise you that. Okay, when you see what's going on in terms of drought, water shortage, etc., and if Mother Nature doesn't finish them off, then robots and artificial intelligence will. Because in societies that didn't have enough people who could do average work when average work was available, when average work disappears, believe me, it will be a freak show compared to what you have today. That is why MBS is in a hurry. I think he understands. Someone referred to, he's driven in a Tesla. So I may be utterly naive, but without a peace process, because neither one is going to defeat the other, they're just going to completely drain each other. And then the Chinese or whoever will come along and bury them. But that will be how the story ends.
I want to get a little bit deeper into Iran in a minute, but just to kind of finish up on the Qatar issue. What is behind this?
Okay,
I mean, you talk to the Qataris and, you talk to the Emiratis and the Saudis, and everybody has a, different view of, is it really about these 14 points that the Saudis and the UAE and the others say that Qatar has to adhere to? Or is it, as Tom says, boys with toys, and this is really, they're not going to make a really consequential? What is with this beef that does seem to be kind of distracting from some of the bigger problems in the region right now, which is Iran?
I will answer that question, but your earlier question was about his foreign policy adventures and whether they were failures or not. Firstly, we've been fighting in Afghanistan since 2001, and we have yet to solve that problem. So the idea that there's a silver bullet solution to Yemen or a silver bullet solution to Lebanon is absurd, right? So these are problems that have to be managed. And the question is MBS managing them well or not?
The question was whether he's spreading himself too thin and not focusing on one at a time.
So I will get to. Let me answer the Qatar thing. But on the foreign policy, I think he has been remarkably successful when it comes to President Putin, and you can see this in a series of production freeze agreements and other things that are coming down the road. And he's also been very successful with the American administration. So those are successes. Now turning to Qatar. So Qatar, essentially, from the Saudi point of view, it's a long-standing problem, but it's particularly acute because since the Arab Spring, it has come to the attention of the Saudis and others in the region that the Qataris
When he says others, he means the Emiratis.
Right.
Other
Well, you're in the front row.
Yusuf.
The Qataris are basically funding all the Saudi dissidents in overseas, in London, etc.
Every one of them.
Most of them. Okay. They are also funding dissidents inside the country. You have hundreds of Saudi military officers who were on the payroll. You had royal princes on the payroll, and you may have had even ministers on the payroll. So Qatar, which is like Monaco to France compared to Saudi Arabia, is meddling in the most kind of intimate way in Saudi Arabia with the aim of toppling the regime, which is bizarre. Because,
and not even possible, is it?
Well, even if it were, Qatar would survive about 3 hours, which is how long it takes to drive across for that regime to topple.
Right.
So it's bizarre. The behavior is kind of bizarre.
Right.
And it's bizarre because a lot of the policies are dependent on the mind of a single individual, right? So highly personalistic form of politics in Qatar, but also in the region. But essentially you have one man who's choosing this policy, and the Saudis, as well as the Emiratis, cannot get them to back off from this kind of funding and this kind of, basically kind of like playing the arsonist in the region and in the internal politics of other countries. And what they're saying is stop being that arsonist. But the Qataris have a big US base, so they can keep putting fires everywhere they want, because that base is the ultimate insurance policy.
Norm.
Excuse me, if I could just dive in on policy
Yes,
successes.
yes.
The Saudis have worked very successfully, in my view, to build a relationship with Muqtada al-Sadr. That is important, and that will enable some form of anti-Iran campaign within Iraq. The Saudis, working very closely with the Emiratis, with the Egyptians, and the Bahrainis, have worked to develop a sort of alliance that has replaced the GCC, which was never terribly effective as a security or regional alliance. And they are moving to develop the Red Sea in a way that I believe will be transformational and important for Egypt, Jordan, as well as Israel. There is no competition between the Emiratis and the Saudis on the Red Sea development. You have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is a profound threat to this country, which has been significantly diminished as a threat by Emirati troops, working in conjunction with the Saudis. But this doesn't get a lot of attention. The Saudi process in Yemen began in 2011, long before Mohammed bin Salman. The Qatari issue began in 1992, I think Bernie would agree, even 1995 in many ways. So these things have long roots, but there have been some profound successes that will transform the region, and I focus on the Emirati, Saudi, Bahraini, Egyptian ties, the Iraq developments, and the Red Sea.
And not to mention the Israeli ties.
Wow, 50 minutes before the I word was used. That's amazing. On a Middle East panel.
Indeed.
Well, let's talk
A new
about.
record.
Well, I mean, look, it's always talked about in kind of hushed terms. This kind of growing alliance between Saudi, Israel, Egypt and Jordan are obviously, have already had relations. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar to some extent. It seems as if the Crown Prince has, taken advantage of this because of him seeing Iran as the real threat. What do you make of this? I mean, it's certainly nobody wants to come out in the open right now because of, the Palestinian question. But it does seem as if this is moving, a lot more far and fast than any of us know.
I'd say it's moving a little far and a little fast, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. I think it's good that I think that Saudi Arabia and Israel have a overriding shared interest in my enemy's enemies, my friend. They share a common enemy, Iran. So that's obviously brought them together now, and in the current context, enabled them to come closer together. But I know a lot about the Arab Peace Initiative, the Saudi Peace Initiative, and the illusion. Like when the Trump people came in, they said, we have a new idea. We're going to do this outside in, not inside out. Why didn't I think of that? Outside in. First, we get all the Arab countries to make peace with Israel. Then the Palestinians will roll over.
It's not how's
that is the
working for them?
dumbest thing I can ever imagine. Okay, as if nobody ever thought of that, and it is a complete and utter illusion.
Well, the
There will be-
Israelis have
yeah.
been trying to do that since Zippy Livni was talking
And
about
so,
it with Kanye,
and I'm saying that the Israelis who think that somehow that their covert relationship in opposition to Iran will translate into public trade, diplomacy, and interaction with Israel, absent a mutually agreed upon peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians, is a complete illusion. So I think it's great if Saudi Arabia and Israel are working better together and one gets overflights. Nothing wrong with that at all. I just think I wouldn't exaggerate it.
And what about the, kind of narrative, again, picking apart some of these narratives, that the Saudis want to get rid of Abbas so they can, make this deal that the Trump administration wants them to, and everybody will, there'll be a new Palestinian leader that'll sign on the dotted line, and everyone will live happily ever after, Steve?
I think it's time for Mahmoud Abbas to go because he's been around too long and he's however old and has clearly lost it. But that, I don't think, has anything to do with what the Saudis want or what the Saudis don't want. I think there's a tendency to exaggerate on both ends. that there's this flowering of this relationship. It really is based on interests and unique capabilities of either country. And I think it's exaggerated when people say that the Saudis are playing this role with the Palestinians and that they're gonna move the Palestinians in a certain direction.
Well, not that they're trying, but that they can.
That they can. It doesn't strike me that that they can. I think that Mohammed bin Salman has a lot of enemies in the region based on some of the things that he has done, and I think they've worked very hard to create this narrative that Mohammed bin Salman has taken on the Trump administration and the Israeli government's view of what's to happen in the Palestinian-Israeli arena and make that happen. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think everybody would like to settle this conflict. But I don't think that I don't think we should exaggerate what role the Saudis is going to play in making this kind of thing happen.
I want to get to Iran with Norm in a second, but Bernie, just quickly, do you think that this is
Well,
an
I mean, look,
exaggerated narrative?
I like a few others here. I've met with him several times. When I speak to him in the local Najdi dialect, so we don't need a translator. And I asked him about.
I do too when I
Yeah.
visit.
and I asked him about Israel and Palestine. So look, he does not have a discourse. He doesn't speak like a traditional Arab leader, which is to say, it's all about Palestine. We can't do anything here domestically until we solve Palestine. So there's none of that with him. There's admiration for the technological prowess of Israel, no question. That he would like Saudi Arabia to be technologically
right.
like
and
that.
the potential
Right.
of
But-
economic ties.
But he is extremely clear that there is to be no normalization ever until the Palestinians are satisfied and get their state. Without Palestinian approval, he will not move because he's not stupid. He knows what his street is about. He knows how his own people feel, and he's not going to be ahead of his people. And to expect him to be is just a recipe for failure. He's just not going to do it.
Norm, let's talk about the Iranian nuclear deal and how now the Saudis are having discussions with the U.S. about nuclear capability. Should the kingdom be allowed the option to eventually enrich as Iran? I mean, there's so much going on right now with, the U.S. is talking to Saudi Arabia about some kind of nuclear, obviously everyone wants the gold standard that, again, our friend has over here. But you should, you kind of are. The U.S. and Saudi are having these nuclear negotiations about buying reactors, and the Saudis are saying, we don't want worse terms than the Iranians have. And do they have a point?
So it's a fair argument, but it needs to be unpacked. First, when you look at the Saudi energy situation, they expend a tremendous amount of their own energy to take care of their power plants and their own energy requirements. Nuclear power will allow them to cease doing so. And I think they're talking about building 16 plants. Saudi Arabia also has a ginormous amount of mineral wealth. I think they estimate the wealth at 1.3 trillion. And even if it's high, that's a tremendous amount of wealth, to include uranium. So they wish to have uranium mines, so they won't have to buy it abroad. I personally believe it's a good thing if we had a uranium bank somewhere, an enriched fuel bank somewhere, like the Emiratis have bought into with 123. That is the gold standard for a reason. But the Saudis do have an argument to make. If Iran, the pariah of the world, is allowed to do this, why the heck can't we? For similar reasons. I think in the end, I would encourage the Saudis to listen to their Emirati partners and to work with a more international perspective. I think the world is better for that. But if they chose a different direction, it's not unreasonable. Now, this said, when you look at American technology versus Chinese technology or Russian or South Korean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, America has some superb technology. We have some issues with the environment, but our technology is pretty good. But we bring restrictions with our technology. Other countries don't bring restrictions, so they have generally weaker, less advanced technology, still perhaps good enough for government work, and the South Korean technology is very good. So you could see the Saudis moving in the direction of another country simply because it doesn't bring our restrictions. End of the day, it's a good thing if the Saudis get their fuel from somewhere else, but in the end of the day, I would understand the logic, at least, of their argument.
Talk to me, Norm. Everyone's kind of weighed in on the threat posed by Iran. Do you see this as the main challenge for Saudi Arabia right now, internationally? And is there a danger of, Tom writes that there's a danger of going after Iran everywhere. What is the real way to counter Iranian influence in the region for Saudi?
Start reading, always read Tom's columns and quote them, okay?
Bless
It's
you.
always a good thing to say, okay?
I do that.
Always a good thing to say, because I do. To answer your question, I would throw out a couple of things. First, when people talk about a Saudi-Iranian rivalry, it doesn't exist. You don't have a sword. You almost have rock, paper, scissors. It's a very different type of game. If I were to ask you to name a Saudi or Emirati proxy group, you can't. If I ask you to name an Iranian proxy group, are all the Iranian proxy groups in one breath? You can't. These are very different tactics and very different ways of working in the region. If you want to look at a really good Iran brief, look at the map. If the maps are all the same color for the countries, that's not Iran's goal. Iran is not looking to control the north of Iraq as they control the south of Iraq. They're not looking to control northeastern Syria as much as they are western Syria. And they're not looking to control all of Yemen as much as they are key areas. But they are looking to control those key areas. The Saudis will have great difficulty getting into those areas without dealing with the Iranians in a similar way with people on the ground. And the Saudis and the Americans and others just aren't very good at that. In the end of the day, what the Saudis and the rest of the world needs to recognize, in my view, is the Quds Force should not exist. We basically have an entity that only one country in the world has got that creates militant proxy groups throughout the region. If anybody thinks the region is safer with Hamas, Izzadin Qasim brigades or the Houthis, raise your hand. If anybody thinks you can make these weaker without taking away Iranian weapons, it's a different story. I'll close with one more point. Nikki Haley has stated in public, and I will refer to her comments, that Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah have provided advanced missile technology that has been fired upon the capital of Riyadh. Let's presume that these were Russians in Mexico in a hypothetical environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How many people here would take it as a good idea if we ended the conflict and just let them stay there? Anybody remember the Russian aircraft in Latin America during the 80s and the Reagan years, that threat? I think you have a problem here. We have different tools facing each other. I will close with one point, and that is, I don't think Iran is strong in many areas. Iran needs chaos and beleaguered Shia and a logistics route. You won't get that in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. You don't get that in Bahrain, even though Bahrain is routinely attacked. But you will get this in certain countries, and extricating Iran from that requires choking off logistics and choking off the Quds Force.
Do you remember when President Obama said that the Saudis and Iran need to learn how to share the region? What did you make of that when he said that?
It's not unreasonable if they're both reasonable. The Iranians have not become reasonable. The JCPOA deal, which has constrained Iran's nuclear program, and I've gone on record supporting it, it has indeed bought time for us to deal with Iran's other behaviors. That's a good thing, but we need to deal with Iran's other behaviors. And if the only way we deal with Iran's other behaviors is to say we won't deal with them because it threatens the deal, well, that just doesn't work out. So if the Iranians through JCPOA had become a more open, reasonable society.
Is that possible? Is there some kind of accommodation with Iran, if not sharing, but bringing Iran into the family of nations? Is that a pipe dream in this?
I don't want to take time, but as the brilliant Kareem Sajidpour and I talk about Iran, the cause, the country, and so forth, Iran only exists as a cause outside of its borders. There are very few countries who wake up in the morning and say, I want to be like Tehran, but there are a fair number who say, I believe in Velayat-e Faqih with the Quds Force states. So the cause of Iran is outside the region. The Saudis did not attempt to dominate Syria or Baghdad, and no one has been able to dominate Yemen in many, many, many decades, if not centuries. So again, I think you have an imbalance of approaches in the region, and that makes this very difficult to solve.
Let's move on to the Trump administration. Tom, obviously a lot has been made of the relationship between the Crown Prince and Jared Kushner. Mm-hmm. Let's start from the U.S. side. Do you believe that the Trump administration is putting too much in this relationship, in this basket?
No, I think that, again, I share this view. I think what MBS represents on his upside is of strategic significance to the United States, to the region, and to the whole world of Islam. I don't think you can exaggerate that. But it's precisely because I believe that I wouldn't assign Jared Kushner to the job. It would be nice if we had an ambassador
That would
in
be
Saudi
nice.
Arabia, like a David Welch. It'd be nice if we had a assistant secretary for the Middle East. That would be nice, a permanent one. It'd be nice if we had a secretary of state who was respected and would be listened to. I proposed even a special envoy, a Jim Baker or a Dave Petraeus. This is so important. And it takes someone who has a real feel for the region, who will be respected, who can, that can connect with MBS, what he's doing, and appreciate it. But at the same time, everyone in life needs a coach. And especially if you're a 32-year-old leader taking power in this country now without a lot of experience in the world, and you're going to do some boneheaded things, buy a yacht here, a Da Vinci there, that are going to, and you got to understand, you are now a really important person. And you have to lead your life in a way that is truly above reproach. So I think he's enormously worth investing in, but you need someone, Jim Baker, I covered Secretary of State Baker for 4 years. He used to say to Bandar, now you sit your royal ass down here and we're gonna have a conversation. Okay, that's what you need, ladies and gentlemen. This is not like, you need someone who can talk to him as an equal, but with respect, and where he knows that we really want him to succeed. And not just one person, but to not even have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. When it's going through, I think, the single most important transformation since I showed up in Beirut with that manual typewriter in 1979, is irresponsible.
There's this kind of feeling that, look, it's the two sons, I mean, the reason that, it's, the family, and this is very tribal, and that's, what the Saudis like, and I think that's one of the reasons maybe that President Trump assigned Jared in the beginning. But do you think they're taking advantage of his relative youth and inexperience? I use relative in quotes.
I don't really know. All I know is
he does seem
you
to
can't
be
just walk
leaning
into the
towards their
middle. You can't
worldview.
just walk into the middle of this story out of the New York real estate scene, not knowing any of the characters, not knowing the language, not really knowing the history, without getting played, one way or another. And it's not enough to stay up till 4 a.m, talking about whatever you're talking about. This requires a sustained, not one visit every 6 months, where boys, get together and with boys. It requires an adult engagement as equals, with a serious American diplomat and administration, with a very serious and incredible opportunity of this, young crown prince, and to assign it to your son-in-law. Look, look at this Arab-Israeli thing, just by example. You know what happened. Abu Mazen came to Trump and said, Mr. Trump, for you, because you are a great man, for you, because you are a great man, we will accept 95% of the West Bank. For you, because you are a great man.
Very kind of him.
And then Trump got on the phone, called Bibi, and discovered that was 95% more than Bibi was ready to give up, okay? So, I could have saved him the phone call, I could have saved him the whole thing, you know what I mean?
Right.
And at some point, experience matters, but not just experience, just adult weight, gravitas. Take the issue and assign it the importance it deserves. And it's not your, I have anything against Jared Kushner, but it's not your 35-year-old, over-leveraged real estate son-in-law.
What does he see? What does he see? This bromance between the two of them. You've been with him. What does he see in this guy?
I mean, I think MBS's answer is, you elected this guy, and this is the person you've sent to me, and that's who I deal with.
Is he playing him though?
No, in what way?
When you hear Jared Kushner's point of view, it does seem very much like MBS's.
Well, I think
He's
that's. But
there's a you talk to Saudis and you talk to others in the region, and they say he listens. He wants to know our point of view, but it seems as if in this kind of mentoring role, he's now taken on the point of view of of his captors.
Well, look, I don't know Mr. Kushner, but I can assure you that as a good friend of Bibi Netanyahu's, Kushner that is, that MBS and Kushner do not share the same view on Israel. Certainly not. So there's a lot of daylight there. Do they see eye to eye on Iran? Do they see eye to eye on how to fight terrorism? Do they see eye to eye on mutual investment and opportunities in each other's countries? Very likely. But I think the challenge for the US, and I think Tom is right, the real challenge for the US is to be able to help the Saudis build capacity, build experience, build real institutions, because that is what that country needs more than anything else. And then ultimately, yes, also bring in outside voices, bring in voices in Saudi Arabia, certainly not lock up critics who are talking about the economy or there are lots of things that need reforming. And I think if I can sum it up in one word, it is about capacity building. It is about institutions and capacity building.
Norm, do you think that there's the capacity in the U.S. to help the Saudis with their capacity? Or do you think the U.S., not just Jared Kushner, I think, again, just as we put too much on MBS, maybe we're putting a little too much on this Jared Kushner because the president is agreeing with everything he wants to do. Is the Trump administration being played here?
So the hard answer, yes, of course there is. They have had armies of the finest consultants in the planet from the United States and other countries in Saudi Arabia, talk to them about modernization reform for a couple of years. These are extremely serious people, all in the private world. You've had our military engage, CENTCOM, the Pentagon, and others with the Saudis for a couple of years. These are very serious people. Likewise, I have read in the newspaper, our intelligence community deal with the Saudis for a number of years on security issues. And I would suspect, based on the positive views I've seen in the newspaper, that has been a successful and an important relationship. Now, when you made the comment, and it is often said, so I know you're repeating it, that is MBS repeating Jared Kushner? It's also conceivable in a world that Jared Kushner or someone in the United States is repeating MBS. And again, it's not just two people. You have those structures of people who engage their Saudi counterparts and come back with, I understand their perspective and they've got this issue. Who the heck has done well in Yemen for the last few thousand years? Who the heck can figure out Iraq? What the heck are you going to do to get the Iranians and Hezbollah out of Syria? These are problems to be managed, not problems to be solved, as it was stated. So I think the U.S. has that capacity, but we need to spread it out it's not just MBS and it's not just Jared Kushner.
And it's also in terms of helping them. How do you?
You can say one thing just to pick up on it, which is that, I wrote about it today in the context of China, that some things are true even if Donald Trump believes them. And one of those things
That's a good point.
Is that Iran today controls 4 Arab capitals. Now, again, if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia and you're surrounded by this thing, even if you want to follow my advice, which is focus on reform at home, out-reform them, soft power, that's a real problem. And somewhere along the way, we have got to find a way to use American power, not to go to war with Iran, but to counterbalance that power, to create the space, maybe the opening for a dialogue. A dialogue will never start if one side feels it's got the gun of another to its head. And I think that's the next great challenge for the next Secretary of State, to find how to do that without getting us in a war with Iran, but somehow the thing is out of balance. Saudi Arabia is not controlling 4 Arab capitals around Iran.
But it does seem there's
four
much more of
capitals.
a coalescence between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia now over Iran than there was under the Obama administration. I mean,
I think it's abundantly clear that for years we've been working for a strategic consensus, and suddenly we found ourselves outside the strategic consensus, and now the United States is back in it with the Trump administration, in line with the Saudis and other regional actors on the Iranian threat and the threat of Islamic extremism. I think it goes without saying. I think just one thing on Jared Kushner and this administration's approach. First, in a way, I understand the logic behind putting Jared Kushner forward. You have sons. There's also this kind of informal way in which the New York real estate world works, in a way similar at a level of abstraction, a kind of informal way politics works among different countries and families in the region and so on and so on. So in a way that it sort of makes a little bit of sense, but it doesn't really work. We need someone there who is a steady hand, who knows what the region, understands what's going on. I think, with all that said, I think the Trump administration's approach to the region and these problems is really a pretty traditional approach.
It is.
It's different from the Obama administration, which said, let's share the region. It's different from the Bush administration, which said, let's remake the region. It's about countering Iran's malign influence, countering the malign influence of Islamic extremism, and bolstering our traditional allies. In that way, it's really a very traditional approach to the region. I don't know, and this is where I take issue with both what Tom and Bernie have said, is I appreciate Tom, 1991, James Baker, sit your royal ass down, and so on and so forth. It's not 1991 anymore. 1991 was the zenith of American power in the region. We had just kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We could drive politics in the region and politics in other countries. It's 2018. A lot of these countries, we say something and they say, yeah, whatever, we're gonna go ahead and do what we want anyway. And so I'm not sure how we build I'm not sure how we build capacity for them.
Okay,
That's
but
really
you,
up
now
to
you have a
them.
president who's more of a deal maker, and before it was sit your royal ass down, and it's
He's a
what
deal
can I
maker.
give you to sit your royal ass down?
He's a deal maker in a book that was ghostwritten for him. He's a deal maker in a book that was ghostwritten for him. I'm not aware of any deals that he's made recently that have been
he's
good
trying
deals
to make
that have
them
been
anyway.
good. So again, whether he's a great deal maker or not, I'm not sure that the Saudis or other countries are sitting up and listening when an important American says, sit your royal butt down and I'm going to tell you what's
we need
what.
we need a new analogy. I want to go to Norm, but Bernie, quick, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Iran needs to be tested as to its, whether it has good faith or not. And I think a good place in which one can do that is in Yemen, because Yemen is really not important for for Iran at all, right? It's just there to irritate the hell out of the Saudis, whereas it's strategically very important to Saudi Arabia. So if a deal can be struck there, which is where I think the two sides can probably most likely meet, then we have a beginning of something better for the region. And I think we should test it, and I think the next Secretary of State should push for that.
I think it's very, very good advice. for
Bernie,
Secretary
I
of
want
State.
you-
Always
Bernie,
right,
what-
but it's not right.
What choices does he have in
Here's
Yemen?
the issue. Here's the
What
reason.
choices
It's
does
absolutely
Saudi
right
have in
the way to
Yemen?
do it. But Zarif is absolutely irrelevant, and he is worthless on this, and he is, with his avuncular, friendly, we want to talk and cooperate style in the region, has for years offered to do this, often with the Omanis in the middle. And the Saudis and others have said, we will try to work this out. And missiles appear in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, firing at, per tweets, also the Emirates, and against the Americans and the French and the British and all the other nationals who live in those countries. This is a virtual missile war, and the conversations we've had with the Iranians in Syria, where they shouldn't have been in the room, one could make a case, but they were brought in the
Can they
room.
not be in the room? They're like one of the major players in there.
But they shouldn't have been a major player there. That goes to Tom's point.
But it's the
I'm
same
with
thing
you.
with the
But-
Russians. How can you not? How can you have
I'm
a
with you.
discussion
I'm
about
just saying,
Syria without the Iranians?
If you bring them there, but
Russians
give
in
you the
room?
point, what did it get us? What did it get us with all of the conversations with Zarif and others? So he's right. This is how the world should
You
work.
should test them. You
Well,
should test them.
and
on that.
we've
I would
tested
not-
them on Yemen,
I-
and we've tested them
scares
here. We need a new version of the test, where we're just going to give more time for the Quds Force to build infrastructure, and more time for Zarif to say it's the Saudi Emirati fill in the blank fault.
I have one more question for you, Norm, and then I want to open it up. I want to give a lot of time for questions because we have such a distinguished audience and a lot of smart people that are going to have interesting things to say. But why is, it started with President Obama's view towards the kingdom. Democrats are increasingly lukewarm towards the kingdom. But the kingdom is doing a lot of things that the West wants. So why is there still such a negative connotation when it comes to Saudi Arabia? For all our discussion, and I think it's been great for us to probe, the wisdom of the Crown Prince's approach or whatever. But you have, for the first time, a Saudi leader who wants to reform, who's, taking all these things that the U.S. has been calling for them to do for so many years. I mean, not just like the easy driving or whatever, but major, major things. Why is there still this antipathy towards Saudi Arabia here in the West?
So it's difficult to explain. I've been in those policy conversations now for 3 presidents and their NSCs. And if someone had said we had a Saudi leadership, which would push back on Iran, give women greater rights, but work to privatize the country and foreign investment, reduce reliance on expatriates, get away from oil, fight their own wars, not to the last American, work with their Arab out. We would have said, by the way, get a little closer to Israel. We would have said, holy cow, what do we have to do to get this? Well, we have it. We actually have it. At the same time, there are those who are invested in the hope that perhaps Iran's demographic change and the potential of Rouhani, which I'm not very sanguine about, I confess, it might be destroyed by a Sunni Shia confrontation of some sort. I don't really understand why we aren't more behind this effort because, and I will close because I think Steve and others want to dive in on this, you just have to imagine the Saudi experiment succeeds. What happens to the region? The Saudi experiment fails. What happens to the region? All right, where do you want to be? That's a conversation in my view.
Steve, what do you think? Why is there this?
Let me just emphasize the dramatic disconnect between much of the commentary in Washington about Saudi Arabia and the way in which Saudis receive news and understand things
Right.
and how they view things. And quite as for a visitor, while many of these things were going on in those kind of critical 2 weeks, it was very hard to process it while I was sitting in Saudi Arabia. Wow, this is odd.
We were there at the same time.
Yeah, it was quite odd, the kind of
disconnect.
bile
Oh my God.
and nastiness that was of the commentary here. I think it's three things. I think in part what Norm said, there is this hope about a rapprochement with Iran and the idea that the Saudis are part of this wedge to prevent this rapprochement with Iran. That also includes the Emiratis, the Israelis, and others. And that if we can just have this rapprochement with Iran, everything in the region will be open to resolution, and that these countries are seen as blocking that kind of thing. So I think there's that piece of it as well. Then, look, for many years, the Saudis haven't really had a great story to tell. This is a country that has, it's an image problem. Women can't drive, Wahhabism, extremism, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think the iconic images for Americans when it comes to Saudi Arabia remains
9/11.
9/11 and 15 of 19 hijackers. Now, when in talks that I give when I talk about Egypt, in fact, and I say how Al-Qaeda was really an Egyptian organization with Saudi financing, people are slack-jawed about this. I think, and I think it's going to take time and a lot of effort on the part of the Saudis to alter that. And I do think that they have a good story to tell now. There's a lot, as Tom said, there's a lot of downside. There's a lot of problems. They're stuck in Yemen. There's all kinds of things. But at least internally, there is a flicker of hope for the future of Saudi Arabia. And we certainly don't want to see it. But as far as I can tell, they haven't really done much to frame that narrative here in a way that's compelling to people, that it doesn't just look like propaganda, it doesn't just look like hired guns, it doesn't seem authentic.
Tom?
Yeah, I would endorse everything that's been said. It's just somehow, just what all three of my colleagues have said. I don't know if this is going to succeed, but it's the best news coming out of Saudi Arabia. It's the best hope that we've had it's forever. I mean, since 1979, and I'm just been stunned at the bile you get directing at you. Say, don't know if it's going to work. Guy's got amazing upsides, got some real downsides. I'm going to really like to work on the upside and the downside. And wow, you just I could get less bile if I came out in support of the NRA.
Okay, I have a completely out-of-the-box explanation
Go
for this.
for it.
I think that, and it's one word, it's Islamophobia. I think that America has been rattled by 9/11 and by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. As good, kind of tolerant Americans, we don't like to say we don't like Muslims, or we're afraid of Muslims, or we have a problem with Muslims. And Saudi Arabia is the perfect
Embodiment.
bogeyman, because you can say, Muslims are fine, except these bad ones over in Saudi. And we got into the habit of constantly saying, Muslims are fine, but except these guys in Saudi. And I think we're still in that kind of broken disc mode of constantly going back and saying, but you're supposed to be bad guys. Why are you doing this? Why is he letting women drive? It doesn't make sense. And I think we're still in that mode, and I think that's what explains it.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. Obviously, I know we have a lot here. Don't be shy. There are so many, smart people in this room. I'd love to hear from a lot of my old friends.
Excuse me, quick footnote. And
Yes.
some of us may be in the audience when you're on panels. So knock yourselves out, okay?
No, let's not. We're going to have an unplugged and unfiltered conversation. There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm going to go to right here first, Karen. And if you could introduce yourself, and let's try and keep the questions short so we can keep it more going as a conversation.
I'm Karen Elliott House. I just wanted to follow that discussion because I'm mystified too by why the Saudis, despite doing all kinds of things that we want, don't gain any improved benefit from it. And how can the answer be that it's Islamophobia? I mean, the Iranians are Muslims. And why is it that 9/11 is more seared in the American mind than 450 plus days of American hostages in Iran? I mean, is it just that was longer ago, or?
Yeah, I think it's longer ago, and also that, when Iranians have killed Americans, and they've killed a lot of Americans, and we should never forget the blood that Americans shed at Iranian hands. Most of it was overseas. It was in Lebanon, it was in Iraq, it was in Saudi Arabia. It was not here. And Iranians are clever. They're not going to stupidly attack us here.
I think it's something else too, Karen.
Our BABCR effort against our dear friend Foreign Minister Adel
Yeah,
Jubeir.
that's true.
That was
the one exception.
That was an exception, an attack in the capital, the U.S. homeland post 9/11, and what happened to the Iranians in response to that was exactly.
I think there's another thing, and that's that Iran, at a time when the Arab world the Sunni Arab world is coming closer to Israel, at a time when the Sunni Arab world is actually embracing an American president who's very unpopular in Europe and other places around the world, Iran still carries the flame of being anti-Israel and anti-American. And for a certain part of the left, that trumps everything.
Sir.
Thank you. A wonderful panel. Walt Cutler, former Foreign Service. I just want to get to the title of this great Arabia Foundation seminar. What do you expect from the visit? We have a highly publicized visit before us next week. Is it beyond just mutual hand-holding, or do you expect some decisions to be made regarding these uncertainties?
Norm.
I think the most important thing that can come from this visit is the establishment of new relationships. It's not unreasonable to think that many of the people who were in the Ritz had many good friends in the West, business partners, cultural partners, friends, et cetera. And then when they came out, they had a story to tell, okay? And it wasn't a good news story about MBS or Saudi Arabia, et cetera. This is a rare opportunity for the Saudis to spend their time building new relationships with people and to have folk in this room, in the business community, in a number of cities sit down and say, who the heck are you and what the heck do you really mean, and have that conversation. I have found that the bile that Tom and I agree occurs, the churlish language, tends to evaporate when people go to the kingdom and they basically say, this is what I see. There's a chance for this to occur here. And I must wave a flag that the ambassador was ambassador in the 80s. We did an exceptional job in the kingdom, and I was a junior officer at the time. So bravo.
Junior officer.
Dates me.
Bernie, what is the Crown Prince hoping to get out of this visit?
Well, I think several things. First, he's visiting something like 8 cities, okay? So in DC, there will be obviously discussions with the administration, hopefully with Congress, so it'll be outreach to government. There will be in New York a lot of business and finance and media. He's going to visit the editorial boards of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Washington Post here. He's going to Boston to see the MIT, Cambridge, Boston innovation.
Seems like he's trying to build that capacity that we're talking about.
Yeah.
It seems as if he's trying to soak up the kind of
Yeah.
U.S. private enterprise to help build that capacity.
And I think one of the things he's going to say is that, I needed to fight and defeat the culture of corruption that was endemic in the kingdom, and that what I did in the Ritz is a one-off, And
Do you think
it
it is
will,
a one-off?
I think it is, and it will never. It will
Does
never,
everyone agree with that?
and it won't
Same
happen
scale,
again.
same scale.
It won't happen again, and it was really
be
not so much. It's not so much just the money that they had to pay back, but it was about changing the behavior and the culture of these people. And you know, you don't have to worry about property rights in the kingdom. I think that's going to be his message. And then, you know, building investment opportunities in both directions, and across, you know, a series of cities, and meeting elites and meeting, you know, scientists, all kinds of people.
Let's go to Karen DeYoung.
It's actually just a follow-on to the previous question. Both governments have said, and certainly said following the president's trip to Riyadh, that they expected massive investment and massive purchases from each other. Certainly President Trump at various times said $100 billion, $300 billion, $500 billion. How realistic is that, and how much do you think the U.S. administration is depending on that, given that it really was a centerpiece of what President Trump said he had achieved during that visit?
Steve, you want to take that one?
I haven't heard a lot of that from coming out of the administration for this trip. I think it was important for the president on his, you know, kind of maiden voyage to sell. I think this trip, this reciprocal trip by the Crown Prince, is really about one of the things that Norm mentioned, which is about people getting to know each other, and then exactly again what Bernie said. These are not my ideas. You know, about meeting people in these different places that can help Saudi Arabia achieve, and Mohammed bin Salman achieve the kinds of things that he wants to do. I'm not aware that there's any kind of big contract, big defense thing. We've sold how much? How much more can the Saudis absorb at this point in terms of weaponry? So it seems to me this is about his ideas about transformation, building a scientific capacity, those kinds of things, getting to know the United States, which I think is a good thing. Because again, going back to the previous discussion, lots of people kind of project certain ideas about Mohammed bin Salman based on this one episode that happened in November.
In
You know,
terms,
just say,
yeah,
can
in
I pick
terms,
up on Karen's
yeah. Let me
question?
also, before you start, in terms of these deliverables that she's talking about, did the Trump administration try to, or did the Saudis kind of front end the president's trip to the extent that, you know, now the deliverables, you know, can't possibly deepen because it was, you know, so front loaded?
I mean, you know, Lisa, you know, and we all know that everyone's now got the Trump playbook. Red carpet, lots of big highway signs, pictures
Steak
of
with
him.
ketchup.
Tons of praise, millions of dollars in contracts for America, and he'll let you do whatever you want.
Don't forget Orb.
And Orb, whatever that was. You know, one of my favorite columns, Karen, I ever did in the Middle East, it was called 1.3. And I wrote it from Lebanon, and I pointed out that the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon had created a scholarship program in Lebanon with $1.3 million that was putting 250 Lebanese public school students from everywhere in the country, giving them scholarships to any four-year American-style university in Lebanon, Beirut Higazian University, American University, Lebanese American University, $1.3 million. The same week, I wrote about that, Hillary Clinton authorized $1.3 billion for the latest F-16 purchase by Egypt for F-16. And I was speaking literally that week at the Teachers College, Columbia Teachers College in Amman. And this Jordanian teacher put it so well. She said, one is for building people, the other is for killing people. And until we get out of this metric of how many arms we sold them, the greatest thing the Crown Prince could do when he come here, announce that I'm devoting $100 million, not $100 billion, to doubling the number of Saudi students studying at any 2-year or 4-year accredited university in America over the next 10 years. If I was to give him one piece of advice, it would be that. The planes, we can talk about some other day. If you don't build human capacity in this age of acceleration, there is nothing they can do, we can do, that are going to help them. They will be roadkill on the superhighway of transformation that the world's going through.
Mona.
Mona Shakaki with Al Arabiya. We all know that the Saudis and a lot of the Gulf countries were not very happy with Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. Now that we have Mike Pompeo, tell us a little bit. Do you think that the relationship will change? What are some things that will happen that are different, if any?
Norm, what do you think?
I have no idea.
Well, I think the rhetoric will be more unified.
I have no idea.
But at the end of the day, there is some hard physics about what you can actually do in the region. So it's easy to say we're pushing back against Iran. It's easy to say we're going to do more to work against Islamic extremism in the region. But truth be told, it's not as if there's a cigar box under someone's bed that says great ideas and things we could do, but we just didn't want to do it because we were too lazy. This is going to be a hard, long-term approach by all the countries in the region. What I think is important, and I think Secretary-designate Pompeo will be very good at this, is I think he's going to be very clear with states I would anticipate, such as Qatar. Knock it off with funding Islamic extremists. Is it really imperative to have a television station that insults everybody in the region except the Qatari royal family? I think those types of conversations will be had, and I think that's important for the region to hear this so that it can knit itself back together again.
Just to play devil's advocate, though, one of the reasons that the Saudis, who had great promise about Secretary Tillerson because of their long-standing relationship with him, did not like him once he came in, is because, obviously he leaned more towards Qatar in terms of their arguments, but he also kind of called a spade on what he thought was some of the Saudi problems, and they didn't like that. So do you anticipate Mike Pompeo will have the kind of honest conversations with the Saudis that need to be had, or is it just going to be a much more of a love fest?
Well, truth be told, I know Mike Pompeo, and I have read in the newspaper that he has had discussions with all of the regional states on their need to do more to push back on Islamic extremism. All right, that's a conversation you want him to continue to have with the Saudis
or about
and others.
Yemen, or about
Yemen. But again, in Yemen, what do we want the Saudis to do? Do we want the Saudis to leave because do you think the Iranians are going to leave and the Quds Force will be there? Does anybody think it's good to have the Iranians on the Bab el-Mandab, which has about 15+% of the world's trade going through every day? I mean, you don't want, do you want peace in Yemen so that Quds Force planes can fly in as they do to Damascus? I mean, these are hard questions you have to talk through in your discussions. But I am convinced that Mike Pompeo will do this. But more importantly, I think the rhetoric, I think, will be unified. But at the end of the day, I'm not looking for any dramatic steps because those steps are all very hard and require physics, mechanics, infrastructure, money, people, stuff that it's hard to come by.
Okay, sir.
Ahmed Yahya, I'm a Saudi analyst. My question is about this notion of a Saudi-Iranian rivalry in the region, one that's rooted in sectarianism. Saudi Arabia has long operated in the region as a nation state within an established order. Iran has worked to overturn that order, and it has largely succeeded since 2011. My question is there really a power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is Iran in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon in order to reclaim dominance from Saudi Arabia? Even in Yemen, I would venture to say, are the Iranians there to spite the Saudi Arabians as the seat of Sunni hegemony or as clients of the United States, or as perceived clients of the United States? To what extent is control of Bab el-Mandeb and the ability to use that as leverage against the West driving their actions in Yemen? The same can be said about the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. So this idea that there needs to be a modus vivendi between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or there needs to be a grand bargain between Saudi Arabia and Iran, seems a little bit problematic. I've done 6 track tours with the Iranians over the past 2 years. And after each one, the consensus that's reached is that there's not much to talk about to the Saudis. What drives the IRGC, what goes on in that planning room, is an urge to uproot this perceived Western imperialism and Western influence in the region, and not to reclaim dominance from Saudi Arabia. So my question is, how do you go forward from a setting like this?
Great question.
And the problem, I think, with this narrative is that it removes the West and makes the West an isolated and removed third party. And that's a big obstacle.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've actually made a number of points. One of them is that Iran is occupying 4 Arab capitals. That's a serious problem, needs to be counterbalanced. And I understand that. Don't think Saudi Arabia is quite as innocent about projecting power regionally through other mechanisms, through schools and whatnot, as you might suggest. So I'll push back a little bit there. But I'd like to. I'd pick up on Bernie's idea. I could almost imagine if we could pull off the kind of sophisticated policy that Norm's alluding to. It's on the one hand, we use this moment around the Iran nuclear deal to really push back on the Iranians publicly, forcefully, that we're not going to sit idle as this happens, and then secretly open a dialogue. Say, you want to get along better? Well, let's have a test case in Yemen. Okay, so I think it's got to be that kind of combination. But there is no parallel in terms of literally occupying for other countries that Saudi Arabia is doing right now. I totally agree with that. So I take your point.
Pick up on that? No? Okay. Said Arakat.
Thank you. My name is Saeed Arakat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. I want to ask about Mr. Trump's deal of the century. Next week, when he is meeting with the Crown Prince, it is insinuated around town that he may take the opportunity of that meeting to reveal his deal of the century. What are the chances that the Saudis are on board? What do you think that? What are the chances that that might happen? Thank you.
Okay. What do you think?
I just don't believe in the deal of the century. I could imagine the Trump administration coming out with a deal that gives Israel more on the West Bank than anyone's ever discussed, maybe 90%. I'm just tossing this out on one side, and actually gives Palestinians a foothold in East Jerusalem on the other, something they never, Israelis never imagined. So I could see something like that, but I just have a hard and fast rule about that conflict, and that is that it only puts a smile on your face when it starts with them.
Is this an empty suit, though? I mean,
I'm just say that if it doesn't come out of the idea that we actually need Jared Kushner, David Friedman, Jason Greenblatt, that we've been waiting for these three Orthodox Jews to figure out this. None of us had figured it out before, and they are going to do it. Bibi Netanyahu, with the aid of binoculars, can see Abu Mazen's office from the Prime Minister's office, literally. I mean, and when they want to find each other, boy, we can really amplify it. We can do the catering. We can do everything. But if that core thing isn't starting with them, like at Oslo, like at Camp David, I just think it'll just be another one for the dustbin of history.
Isn't this an empty suit, though? I mean, they're not talking to the Palestinians. The Saudis and others have said, like, until you give the Palestinians kind of something that they're looking for, no Palestinians and no Arabs really
Can I just pick up on that?
No one showed up to this Gaza conference. Right. I mean, I feel like it's this enigma and a riddle that, I don't know that there's anything on paper. Maybe there is.
When they did the Jerusalem thing, extending the American, whatever we did, recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, I got called. This was like a rare event for me from someone in the White House, saying we just did this, and I said, oh, that's really interesting. What did you get? What did you get in return? And the line was silent for about 30 seconds. Then I got to go to my next call. You know what I mean? So now imagine Trump, the great deal maker, had come to Netanyahu and said, look, I'm actually going to give you something you really want, a recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And in return, you're going to put a freeze on all Israeli settlements outside of the blocks. Dead freeze, not another nail.
Indefinitely.
Okay? Just a dead freeze. Then you go to Abu Mazen, you say, look, Abu Mazen, no, you're not going to like this, but I got you something no American president has ever gotten you. Then you come home and Trump says to Obama, I got something you never got. And instead, we gave it away for free. We gave away the greatest piece of real estate we had in our diplomatic arsenal for free. That's called the art of the giveaway. Having that also followed, giving away what I think was the single stupidest act in American foreign policy since I don't know when, tearing up the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, a 12-nation coalition to counterbalance China in Asia, controlling 40% of the U.S. economy based on American interests and values, and tearing it up. The way Bibi clinked his champagne glass in Jerusalem when that happened was only mirrored tenfold by the way the Chinese did it in Beijing.
it doesn't seem as if it was taken very well in the region, though. I mean, if you had this openness to trying to help push the Palestinians towards accepting a deal before the embassy, it doesn't seem as if that, kind of warmth towards the idea is there now.
No, and my understanding is that this is something that Mohammed bin Salman was taken aback by. Of course, the administration signaled it, but through this vaunted channel between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman, he was still surprised by what's happening. But I'm not sure it's worth time dwelling on the Israelis and the Palestinians because there's no peace process and there's no peace to be had. There's no two-state solution to be had.
Sorry, Said. Next.
Thank you. Zaid Benjamin from Radio Sawa. My question, you spoke about Qatar as an example of doing problems for Saudi Arabia. And my question is larger than Qatar. How do you see the Sunni divide in the region? I mean, Turkey, for example, not being in the same front
Bernie?
with Saudi Arabia and fighting with Iran, and also Pakistan, for example.
Bernie, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think that that is a real issue, and it's also, unfortunately, I think it's endemic to the Sunnis. I mean, the Sunnis are more like the Protestants. There's no hierarchy, central hierarchy. It's not like with the Shia, and there are different poles and centers of power. One Arab, the other Turkish, another South Asian, Pakistani, and they don't pull together. And in fact, things are getting worse. Turkey seems to be bent on wanting to recreate some idea of an Ottoman caliphate, which is really, frankly, bizarre. I mean, given how strongly it's emphasized it's being a nation state for decades. It still acts like a nation state when it comes to Kurdish irredentist and nationalist ambitions, so it doesn't act like a Muslim power. The Saudis have an issue with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood are an important component of a number of Arab societies. I don't see how one can completely exclude them. One has to somehow find an accommodation with them as well. So it's unfortunate, and I think what it does is it creates a profound structural weakness in the Sunni world. And I think, in fact, and this is just me speculating, I think that when President Obama was in the White House, he looked at this landscape and he said, if I have a problem with the Iranians or some Shiite militia, there's one phone call to make, and that's to, the supreme leader in Iran. If I have a problem with some Sunni non-state actor, who do you call? Like, what's the address?
But what's the difference if you can't reach the supreme leader that you don't know who you're calling in the Saudi world?
Well, I mean, there are ways of reaching the Iranians. I mean, you can make it clear to them that if they take out our soldiers, we'll take out theirs. I mean, there are ways of dealing with them. But ultimately, the point being that structurally, the Shias look very elegant, and because of this monolithic structure, whereas the Sunnis look like they're all over the place.
So I just, and this will be my last comment. There's only soft tissue now between Tehran and Tel Aviv for the exact reason that Bernie said. I guarantee if the Shah of Iran were in power now, he would be in that area because it's just soft tissue. But I would just say this, as a columnist for the New York Times, sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, sometimes you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And last August, I found myself traveling with the head of the US Air Force to visit all our air bases in the Middle East. And I found myself on our first night in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And I turned on the TV, and there was Donald Trump giving his press conference about Charlottesville. And the whole country is aflame about his support for white supremacists, basically, on both. So I'm staring at a blank screen because it happened to be a Tuesday night, and my column was due that night. And I'm in Udeid, Qatar. So I thought, what the hell do I write? And then I looked around at my little traveling party. I was with the head of the US Air Force, Dave Goldfein, he's Jewish. I was traveling with the Air Force Secretary, Heather Wilson, she's a woman. Her chief executive officer was an African-American Air Force woman lieutenant colonel. Their guard's name was Juan. The head of the US Air War in the Middle East is an Armenian-American. His deputy is a Lebanese-American, and the chief intelligence briefer at Al Udeid's name was Yang. Okay, out of many we can make one. And in this world, unless you can make one out of many, if tribalism is going to eat at everything you do, you will never, ever succeed.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to take a quick lightning round of last questions. Okay, we're going to do it really quick, and you're going to be very quick with your questions. We're going to start here, then we're going to go back to Joyce, and then we're going to take these last two right here. Very quick.
Daniel Serwer, professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I haven't heard a single good idea about how to counter the IRGC.
Okay, that was quick. Well, that's not what the panel is about, but whatever.
I thank you, Joyce Karam with the National. Two very quick questions.
One very quick question.
What can Trump offer on the counter-Iran strategy? And is Saudi Arabia, by being too close to Trump, running the risk of alienating Democrats in the U.S.?
Thank you,
Dr. Heikel,
Joyce,
to you,
come
what
on.
will MBS do on this visit to address this?
Okay. Did someone back there have a question?
Yes, my question. President Abbas said in a UN speech that he wants an alternative to the US as a mediator. And he said to the Indian Prime Minister he wants a multiple country mediation. Is that possible?
All right, I think we might skip that because this is about Saudi Arabia, but if we have time, we'll get to that, okay? 1, 2, very quick, come on.
Mark Cadell with Chevron. Has Mohammed bin Salman eliminated all of his rivals?
Good question.
Walid Abdul Jawad, الشرق الأوسط. Oil for security, is it still a valid equation between the Saudis and the...
Okay, I'm just going to go to all my panelists, take what you want, and we're going to wrap it up. Steve, go.
I'll just take the last one. Oil for security is still valid, but it has less to do with Saudi Arabia than anything else. It has to do with getting that oil out of the Persian Gulf to our main trading partners. We don't need Saudi Arabian oil. We get most of our oil from somewhere else, including the United States. But to the extent that we want to continue to have a healthy global capitalist economy, that energy needs to go to South Korea, Japan, China, and other places.
Norm, you have any last thoughts?
There are certainly ways to push back on Iran in the region, but since I'm staring at cameras and presume somebody in Tehran may watch this tonight, I'm not going to be very expansive. But one good thing to do is to have the Europeans tell the Iranians that JCPOA is not going to be the sum of the entire relationship, and there will be pressures, financial pressures on Iran unless they cease their malign regional adventurism.
Do you think that that'll be enough for President Trump to stay in the deal?
It depends on how hard the Europeans press and what they push forward. If it's going to be another dialogue with Zarif, no. But if it's an actual pressure on the Iranian financial infrastructure, which is owed and
Think they're
promised by
willing to
Secretary
do that,
Kerry,
though?
we'll see as we get closer to May 12th and Secretary-designate Pompeo gives his first policy speeches on this.
Okay. Bernie, has
All
he
right.
eliminated all his rivals?
Yes, I'll get to that in 1 second. I just want to remind you of one thing, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. The only time the Iranians have ever really made serious concessions to the Americans is when America had troops on either side of its border, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I don't recall them ever.
The JCPOA deal was a serious concession. We didn't have troops.
Yeah, but they loved that. I mean, they wanted that. I mean, one can say it played in their favor. And in any case, as far as Joyce, you're absolutely right. The Saudis should not put their eggs in one basket. They should not just rely on the Republicans. Saudi Arabia and their interests. By the way, this goes for Israel as well. Yeah, should be a bipartisan issue. Both parties should care about what happens in both countries, and it is a mistake to put one's eggs in just one administration's basket. On the opponents and enemies, I mean, I think that Mohammed bin Salman has been able to, with the help of his father, clearly. I mean, without his father, none of this would have been possible. To assert himself in the royal family. I don't think he has any serious challenges from the royal family. He will be unless he's assassinated, God forbid. He is the next king of Saudi Arabia. And no one is going to challenge him from the royals, and I don't think the Islamists will challenge him anytime soon. In the long term, maybe. Yeah, and I think that's it, right?
I think that the thing he needs most is opponents. Civil, engaged opponents that care about Saudi Arabia's future, who are welcome to criticize him without being jailed or silenced I think he won't succeed unless he empowers that kind of decent, friendly, but caring criticism.
Does he have it in that, Bernie?
To tolerate a loyal opposition? I think not now. Right now, I mean, right
Very
now.
honest answer.
I mean, right now, I think that the country needs to move and turn on a dime, and to do that, it's very difficult to do it through open, deliberative politics.
But isn't this the kind of open, deliberative society he's trying, or is it not? Is it just a socially tolerant, free of religious extremism? Are we looking for like a, again, like, is it going to be a kind of China model where it's like only the, financial openness, but not the...
Hey, but what's wrong with the China model? Looking at it
there's
from
nothing
Riyadh,
wrong with it. But what I'm
good.
saying is, is it too much to expect that this is going to be a pluralistic democratic society ultimately, or do we need to accept the fact that this is one king, one ruler, and there may be more religious openness and more social tolerance, but political
Let's just start
opposition.
with decency, heading in a good direction. Before we get democracy, pluralism, let's just decent, respectful of women, respectful of pluralism, and heading in the right direction. And I'll if I live to see that, I'll be happy.
And I think, Tom, sort of whispered to say that, Saudi Arabia is not China, and that's true. And I think that in Saudi Arabia, you do have a culture of dissent, of political dissent, and it will have to be accommodated.
That's the point. Is that it is too much to suggest democracy, pluralism, but to get to the place that Tom wants to get, it can't be. There has to be some degree of consensus. There has to be some degree of tolerance.
Won't be sustainable otherwise.
Otherwise, he's going to run into all kinds of trouble.
All right, well, that was a lot of great points and good discussion. And again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Ali and the Arabia Foundation. Thank you to my panel.
Great job. Really good.